In the book of Philippians, the 4th chapter, in verse 13, we read where the Apostle Paul tells us something. I think most of us are familiar with the words, where he says that he can do all things through Christ, which strengtheneth him. And you look at that, and I remember some years back, I heard a man who told me he could control the weather. And I said, well, how is that? And he said, I can do all things, the Lord told me. And I've heard other people make that pronouncement on various things, but is that really what Paul said? And is there encouragement in here for us? In that passage, you look, and he says, I can do all things through Christ which strengtheneth me. But one thing I know is that is not limited, not unlimited, rather. Because the Apostle Paul, you think about when he wrote it, where was he? He was in prison. Well, why didn't he avoid prison? Why didn't he just cast those aside who would have taken him and placed him into that prison? Whenever you look at the context, he speaks about the fact that at times he was abased, other times he was hungry, other times he suffered need, other times, in verse 14, he was in affliction. You go back to the book of 2 Corinthians, the 11th chapter, and if you want a real shocker, read in verse 24 through 28 about all the things that came upon him, about how he was beaten, how he was beaten with a rod, he was cast into prison, he was cast into the sea, he was stoned, all of these things. Why didn't he stop those? And the reality is, that's not what Jesus is talking about at all. The fact is, there are many things that come upon us. 2 Timothy 1 and verse 12, we find, or 3 and verse 12, we find that if we live godly in Christ Jesus, we'll suffer persecution. Bad things happen. Peter addresses that also because we live the Christian life. The world is in darkness, we're light, they don't like it, and we suffer because of it. There are other things just happen because of the normal course of things. Paul wrote about one of his, Timothy, had a stomach ailment. I'm sure that it bothered Paul to see Timothy going through that. There was another who was nigh unto death, and yet Paul didn't avoid that. He didn't stop it from happening. But what God did promise, and this is something that you and I hold on to, and it is the truth of the passage, that in all of those things, whatever happened, notice in verse 11, he says, whatsoever state I am in. So whether it be the persecutions, whether it be the natural losses, the discouragements, the trials that come upon us in this world, we know that we can be content. Now, in the first century, that word content wasn't used very much in the Bible, but it was used in society. And it was the Stoics that used it, and what they did, they thought, you've heard of people who are just stoic. They can stand there, nothing bothers them. And that's the way some people looked at that word. I can do it by myself. I can bear this. I can take this. But Paul didn't say that. He learned to be content. He learned to stand. He learned to endure. But in verse 13, he says, I can do this through Christ, which strengtheneth me. And so we know that we have this promise today because Jesus has told us he'll never leave us nor forsake us. Hebrews 11th chapter and verse 6. You find that also we are told in Matthew 28 and verse 20, he's with us always, even unto the end of the world. And so we have this assurance. We have the assurance we're in a world in which bad things happen. We have the assurance that if we live godly, we'll suffer for it at times. But we have the blessed promise that I can be content in whatsoever state I am. That's because my treasures aren't here, my guide isn't here, my hope isn't here, but all of that is in heaven where Jesus has prepared it for me. And he's given each of us the way. 1 Corinthians 10 and verse 13 is really a companion to this. God will not allow us to be tempted above that we're able to bear, but will the temptation provide a way of escape that we can bear it. So no matter what the world throws at us, no matter what the devil throws at us, no matter what the enemies throw at us, we need to realize that we too can learn to be content. How? Because I can do all things through Christ, which strengtheneth me. The question then comes, if I'm not making it in this world, if this world is overcoming me, am I with Christ? Galatians, the 3rd chapter, verse 26 and 27, we're children of God by faith in Christ Jesus, for as many as have been baptized into Christ have put on Christ. I challenge you to find another way to be in Christ. You won't. But once you're in Christ, you need to continue to walk with him. Paul said in 1 Corinthians 11, he followed Christ, and thus he was able to say, follow me. He was content, not without trouble, but he made it through because he was with Christ. If you have that need tonight, perhaps you need to become a child of God, or maybe you need to renew and strengthen your relationship with God. And if we can help you to do that, let's do it as we stand and sing the song of invitation.